There's an organization that has controlled 190 countries for 60 years, and it operates in plain sight. It doesn't use armies. It doesn't stage coups. It offers something far more powerful: money when you're desperate. But here's the paradox. Every country that accepts its help ends up poorer, weaker, and more dependent than before. Every single one. This isn't conspiracy theory. This isn't anti-Western propaganda. This is the documented, audited, publicly available record of how global finance actually works. The organization has a name. You've heard it before. You just never understood what it really does. Let me show you. $1.4 trillion. That's the number that should be on every front page, every news broadcast, every political debate. That's what developing nations paid in 2023, not on building schools, not on hospitals, not on roads, just on servicing the interest of their foreign debt. Not the principal, just the interest. Picture that amount as physical cash stacked in $100 bills. It would stretch past the moon. And every single year that money flows from the poorest countries on earth into gleaming financial offices in Washington, London, and Paris. But here's the number that should make you pause. For every $1 of aid that flows into the global south, $14 flow out. Through underpriced exports, overcharged imports tax loopholes, and profits extracted by foreign investors. Over the past 60 years, $62 trillion has been drained from poor nations into the banks of wealthy ones. And at the center of this machinery sits an institution most people barely understand: the International Monetary Fund. Grace Mulenga still remembers the exact moment she understood her country had been sold. She was 34, a school teacher in Kitwe, Zambia, standing in the staff room when the radio announced the copper mines had been privatized. Her father had worked those mines for 26 years, her grandfather before him. The mines were Zambia's heartbeat, the reason her town existed, the reason her school existed, the reason she had a job at all. The radio said foreign investors would bring efficiency. Grace felt her stomach drop. Within 3 years, her father was unemployed, her school had cut 2 teachers, and the hospital where her son was born had closed its maternity ward. The mines still operate today. The copper still flows, but the profits flow to London. What most people get fundamentally wrong about the IMF is thinking it's a rescue mission. The story we're told goes like this. A country faces crisis. The IMF steps in like a financial firefighter. Loans are given. Stability returns. Everyone wins. That story is a fairy tale. The reality documented in independent evaluations tells the opposite. Countries under IMF programs grow an average of 1.5 percentage points less than projected. Not a small miss. Entire economies slowing down precisely when they were supposed to recover. The firefighter arrives, and somehow the building burns faster. Here's a question that should bother you. If the IMF has been helping developing nations for 60 years, why are there twice as many Africans living in poverty today than when the programs began? Dmitry Volkov remembers the exact moment Russia's future was decided. It was January 2, 1992. He was 41, an engineer at the Kirov Machine Works in St. Petersburg, watching the television in the break room with 30 colleagues. President Yeltsin appeared on screen announcing shock therapy. Prices would be freed overnight. Industries privatized immediately. The economy opened to the world. Dmitry looked around the room. Nobody was smiling. By that evening, the price of bread had tripled. By that month, his life savings, 14,000 rubles carefully accumulated over 18 years, could barely buy groceries. By that year, the factory had closed, and Dmitry was selling cigarettes on the street corner where he used to catch the bus to work. Meanwhile, in a Moscow office building, a different story was unfolding. Roman Abramovich was 25 years old in 1992, with no engineering degree, no factory experience, no life savings to lose. But he had something more valuable: connections and timing. While engineers like Dmitry watched their savings evaporate, men like Roman bought oil fields, aluminum plants, and steel mills for fractions of their value. The same economic collapse that destroyed Dmitry's career created Romans' billions. Same country, same year, same policy. Opposite outcomes. One liner worth remembering: shock therapy wasn't a treatment. It was a heist with economic theory as the alibi. Now visualize a map of the world with red, indicating countries under active IMF programs. In 1980, a handful of nations lit up mostly in Latin America. By 1990, the red had spread across Africa. By 2000, it covered Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. Today, nearly 60% of low-income countries face what economists politely call debt distress, meaning they cannot meet their obligations, meaning they spend more paying creditors than caring for citizens. The pattern never changes. Only the victims rotate. Maria Elena Gutierrez was 52 years old in December 2001, standing in line outside a Buenos Aires bank at 4 a.m. She had taught mathematics for 27 years. Her entire retirement savings, 43,000 pesos, supposedly equal to $43,000 under Argentina's IMF-approved currency system, sat in that bank. The night before, the government had announced a freeze. Nobody could withdraw more than 250 pesos per week. Maria Elena stood in that line for 11 hours. When she finally reached the counter, the teller apologized and said there was nothing left. The peso was devalued days later. Her $43,000 became 14,000, then 8,000, then a number too painful to calculate. She went back to teaching the following Monday because she had no other choice. Argentina had followed the IMF playbook precisely. They privatized industries, they opened markets, they maintained the currency peg they were told to maintain. And they collapsed anyway, not despite the program, but because of it. Here's the second question that should unsettle you. If the IMF's advice repeatedly produces catastrophe, why do countries keep following it? The answer reveals something darker than incompetence. The power structure inside the IMF tells its own story. Picture an org chart, but instead of job titles, fill it with voting percentages. Out of 190 member nations, one country holds veto power over every major decision. The United States. The global North combined controls 9 times more voting power than the global South. For 65 consecutive years, the IMF managing director has been European. Not once has a developing nation, the supposed beneficiaries of this institution, led it. That's not a global institution. That's a boardroom where the debtors have no seat, and the creditors write all the rules. One more one-liner to carry with you. Colonialism didn't end. It just traded armies for accountants. James Mwangi sits in a small office in Nairobi, Kenya, surrounded by economic reports he's been collecting for 30 years. He's 61 now, a former World Bank consultant who left after seeing too much. His shelves hold documentation of what he calls the extraction machine loan agreements, structural adjustment terms, privatization contracts. He pulls out a folder and shows me a single page. This, he says quietly, is a country signing away its sovereignty. They think they're getting a loan. What they're actually getting is an instruction manual on how to dismantle themselves. The folder contains hundreds of pages, one for each nation. But to understand how the IMF became this, how an institution created to rescue countries became the mechanism of their impoverishment, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to 1944, to a resort town in New Hampshire, to a group of men who believed they were building a better world. One of them was a brilliant economist from a poor immigrant family, a man who understood what economic struggle looked like. His name was Harry Dexter White, and his creation would become something he never intended. July 1944. The world was still at war. Nazi Germany hadn't surrendered. The Pacific Theater raged on. And yet, in a quiet resort town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods, 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered to design what comes after. They understood something profound. Wars aren't just won with bullets. They're won and lost through economics. The Great Depression had destabilized democracies across Europe. Economic desperation had opened the door to fascism. If the post-war world was going to survive, it needed a financial system that prevented collapse. Harry Dexter White stood at the center of this gathering. Picture a short, intense man with wire-rimmed glasses, chain-smoking through 18-hour negotiating sessions. He was 42 years old, the son of Lithuanian Jewish immigrants who ran a hardware store in Boston. White didn't attend college until he was 30, too poor, too busy working. When he finally got there, his brilliance was undeniable. Harvard, Treasury Department, and now the most important economic negotiation in history. White had a vision: create an international fund that would stabilize currencies and provide emergency loans to countries in crisis. Not charity temporary assistance. A financial fire department for nations. When a country's economy caught fire, the fund would provide cash to stop the bleeding, then step back once stability returned. The key word was temporary. That distinction matters enormously. Think of it like a hospital emergency room. You arrive with a broken leg. The doctors stabilize you, set the bone, give you crutches. You heal and leave. The hospital doesn't follow you home, doesn't tell you what to eat, doesn't restructure your entire life. It treats the emergency and releases you. That was White's vision for the IMF. Emergency stabilization. Temporary support. Sovereignty preserved. What most people get wrong about the IMF's founding is assuming it was designed for exploitation. It wasn't. The men at Bretton Woods genuinely believed they were preventing future wars through economic cooperation. White himself was so committed to international collaboration that he was later accused controversially of being too sympathetic to the Soviet Union. The institution began with good intentions. Understanding that makes what happened next even more disturbing. For the first 2 decades, the IMF operated roughly as intended. Countries faced currency crises received short-term loans, stabilized, and repaid. The system worked because the loans came with minimal conditions. Borrow money, fix the immediate problem, pay it back. Simple. But here's the first mini-climax, the moment the machinery began to shift. In the 1950s and 1960s, a wave of independence swept across Asia and Africa. Colonized nations finally broke free from European empires. Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963. Dozens of new flags, new anthems, new governments. But freedom on paper doesn't repair what centuries of extraction destroyed. Kwame Asante was 23 years old in 1957, dancing in the streets of Accra when Ghana declared independence. He remembers the feeling, pure joy, pure possibility. His father had been a cocoa farmer under British rule, forced to sell his harvest at prices set in London. Independence meant Ghanaians would finally control their own resources, their own destiny. Kwame became a civil servant in the new government, helping to build the nation from scratch. He didn't know that the borders he celebrated had been drawn arbitrarily by Europeans who never visited the land. He didn't know that the economy he was inheriting had been designed for extraction, not development. Visualize a map of colonial Africa. The borders are straight lines, unnaturally straight, cutting through ethnic groups, splitting tribes, forcing rivals into the same territories. Those borders weren't designed for the people living there. They were designed for administrative convenience in London, Paris, and Brussels. Now visualize the infrastructure those colonizers left behind. Railways. But look closer. Every railway leads to a port. Not to connect cities within the country. Not to facilitate internal trade. The railways exist to move resources from the interior to ships bound for Europe. That's not infrastructure for development. That's infrastructure for extraction. When independence came, new nations inherited these extraction systems plus debt. The colonizers didn't leave gracefully. They left invoices. So what does a newly independent country do when it's broke before it begins? When it has debt but no industry? When its roads lead only to ports built to ship wealth away, it borrows. And the IMF is there waiting. Here's the first direct question. If you design a system where newly independent nations must borrow to survive, and you control the terms of borrowing, who really has power? The borrower or the lender? The answer became clear in the 1970s when everything changed. In 1971, Nixon severed the dollar from gold, collapsing the Bretton Woods currency system. In 1973, oil prices quadrupled overnight when OPEC imposed an embargo. Suddenly, every oil-importing nation faced crisis. Balance of payments collapsed. Currencies destabilized. The emergency room was overwhelmed. This is the micro-hook, the pivot point that transforms everything after. Commercial banks in the United States and Europe were flush with cash petrodollars deposited by newly wealthy oil states. They needed to lend that money somewhere. Developing nations needed to borrow. It seemed like a perfect match. But commercial bank loans carried high interest rates that fluctuated with global markets. When rates spiked in the early 1980s, deliberately raised by the Federal Reserve to fight American inflation, developing nations found themselves drowning. Debts that seemed manageable at 6% became impossible at 18%. Country after country defaulted. Mexico in 1982, Argentina, Brazil, the Philippines, Poland, Nigeria, and now the IMF transformed. Remember Grace Mulenga from Part 1, the Zambian teacher who watched her country's copper mines sold off. Her story didn't begin with privatization. It began here in the debt crisis of the 1980s, when Zambia's foreign debt became unpayable, and the IMF arrived with a new kind of offer. Not just loans. Conditions. Detailed specific conditions telling governments exactly how to restructure their economies. Cut public spending, privatize state enterprises, open markets to foreign competition, devalue currencies, eliminate subsidies. This was called structural adjustment. Think of the hospital analogy again. Now imagine you arrive with a broken leg and the doctors say, "We'll set your bone, but first you need to sell your car, fire your housekeeper, change your diet, move to a smaller apartment. Let us redesign your entire life. Then we'll treat the leg." That's structural adjustment. The emergency became leverage. The loan became a leash. One-liner worth remembering. The IMF stopped being a fire department and became an architect redesigning entire economies while they burned. The mechanism works like this. A country faces crisis. It cannot pay debts. It approaches the IMF. The fund offers a loan, but only if the country agrees to a list of conditions. Those conditions typically include cutting government budgets, which means fewer teachers like Grace Mulenga, privatizing national assets like Zambia's copper mines, and opening markets to foreign competition, which often destroys local industries. The country has no choice. Without the IMF loan, it cannot access international credit markets. It cannot import essential goods. It cannot function. So it signs. But here's the unexpected twist. The conditions often make the economy worse, not better. When governments cut spending during a crisis, demand collapses. When state enterprises are sold cheaply to foreign buyers, national wealth transfers abroad. When markets open before local industries can compete, those industries die. Independent evaluations confirm this. Countries under IMF programs consistently underperform projections. The medicine doesn't cure the disease. It extends it. Joseph Hanlon spent 40 years studying debt in Mozambique. He's 73 now, a researcher at the London School of Economics, and he's documented something remarkable. Mozambique has received debt relief multiple times. Each time the debt returns larger than before. It's not a rescue, Hanlon told me. It's a revolving door. Countries enter poor and exit poorer, then return when they can't make payments on the new debt. Second direct question. If a doctor's patients keep getting sicker, do you blame the patients or examine the treatment? The treatment is the problem. But the treatment continues because it benefits certain parties enormously. When state assets are privatized, someone buys them. When markets open, someone's products flood in. When debts are serviced, someone collects the payments. The system isn't failing. It's succeeding for the creditors, the corporations, the countries that control the IMF's voting shares. Amara Diallo was a textile worker in Dakar, Senegal in 1985. She was 28, married with 2 children. The factory where she worked produced fabric for the domestic market, traditional patterns, local designs. When Senegal signed its structural adjustment agreement, tariffs on imported textiles were removed. Within 18 months, cheap fabric from Asia flooded the market. Amara's factory couldn't compete on price. It closed. She never worked in textiles again. Somewhere in Asia, a factory expanded to meet the new demand. Somewhere in Senegal, an industry died. One more one-liner structural adjustment didn't adjust structures. It demolished them. By the late 1980s, the pattern was undeniable. Africa's manufacturing sector had collapsed. Agricultural exports had plummeted. Poverty had increased, not decreased. 13 years of IMF programs across the continent produced less than 1% total GDP growth. But the debts remained, and the conditions continued. The IMF had undergone what economists politely call mission creep. What began as currency stabilization had expanded into dictating trade policy, banking law, labor regulations, even how governments should structure their budgets. Each loan came with a checklist. Each checkbox meant less sovereignty. And then, the Soviet Union fell. Suddenly, the IMF's formula had a new testing ground, not former colonies struggling with independence, but a superpower struggling with transition. They called what happened next shock therapy. And Dmitry Volkov, the engineer selling cigarettes on a St. Petersburg street corner, was about to discover what that therapy actually meant. December 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed. 70 years of communist rule ended not with invasion, but with paperwork. 15 new nations emerged from the rubble, and the largest, Russia, faced a question that would determine the fate of 150 million people. How do you transform a command economy into a market economy? The IMF had an answer. They called it shock therapy. The public story goes like this. Russia needed rapid reform. Gradual transition would fail. Only immediate total transformation could work. Free prices overnight. Privatize everything at once. Open markets completely. Yes, there would be short-term pain, but long-term prosperity would follow. That was the story. Here's what actually happened. Dmitry Volkov, the engineer from Part 1, who ended up selling cigarettes, had saved 14,000 rubles over 18 years. That money represented something beyond numbers. It was proof that the system worked, that discipline paid off, that a man could build something for his family. On January 1st, 1992, those rubles could buy a decent used car. By February, they could buy groceries for a month. By December, they could buy almost nothing. Prices didn't just rise, they exploded. Inflation hit 500% in 1992 alone. Visualize a graph with a line going not up, but vertical, straight toward the ceiling, then through it. But here's what the standard narrative leaves out. While Dmitry watched his savings evaporate, a small group of men were making the opposite journey. Boris Berezovsky was a mathematician turned car dealer. In 1992, he was moderately wealthy. By 1997, he controlled Russia's largest television network, a major oil company, and Aeroflot Airlines. His net worth exceeded $3 billion. Mikhail Khodorkovsky ran a small bank in 1990. By 1997, he owned Yukos, one of the world's largest oil companies. He became Russia's richest man. Roman Abramovich, the young man with connections from Part 1, acquired Sibneft, another oil giant, for approximately $100 million. Within years, it was worth $13 billion. Same country, same policy, same years. One group lost everything. Another group became billionaires. Here's the first direct question. When a policy creates billionaires and beggars simultaneously, is that a failure Or is that the point? What most people get fundamentally wrong about shock therapy is believing it failed. It didn't fail. It succeeded spectacularly for the people it was designed to benefit. The privatization of Russian state assets was the largest transfer of wealth in human history. Factories, oil fields, mines, utilities, all sold in rigged auctions to insiders with political connections. The process was called loans for shares, and it worked like this. The government borrowed money from oligarchs using state companies as collateral. When the government inevitably couldn't repay, the oligarchs kept the companies. They acquired billions in assets for millions in loans. One liner worth remembering: Russia didn't transition to capitalism. It was looted under the banner of capitalism. The IMF watched this happen. Their advisors were in Moscow. Their conditions shaped the policies. When critics pointed out the corruption, the response was always the same: stay the course. Short-term pain, long-term gain. Trust the process. The Russian people trusted the process. Life expectancy dropped by 5 years, an unprecedented peacetime collapse. Poverty rates quintupled. Suicide rates doubled. Birth rates cratered. Demographers have a term for what happened: excess mortality. Between 1992 and 2000, approximately 2.5 million Russians died earlier than they would have under previous trends. That's not an economic transition. That's a demographic catastrophe. First, micro-hook. The same formula that gutted Russia was simultaneously being applied across another continent, and the results were somehow even worse. Remember Grace Mulenga, the Zambian teacher who watched her country's copper mines get sold? Let me tell you the full story now. Zambia's copper belt was one of the world's richest mineral deposits. For decades after independence, the mines were state-owned. They weren't run. Perfectly, corruption existed, inefficiencies accumulated. But the revenue stayed in Zambia. It funded schools like the one where Grace taught. It funded the hospital where her son was born. It funded the roads that connected her town to the capital. In the 1990s, under IMF pressure, Zambia agreed to privatize the mines. The public story: private ownership would bring efficiency, investment, modern technology. Zambia would prosper. The reality: the mines were sold to foreign corporations at a fraction of their value. The sales included extraordinary terms: tax holidays lasting decades, exemptions from environmental regulations, permission to repatriate all profits overseas. Zambia kept the holes in the ground. The wealth flowed to London, Toronto, and Geneva. Visualize a mining operation: massive trucks hauling copper ore, smelters processing raw material into refined metal, ships carrying that metal to ports. Now visualize the money flowing in the opposite direction, out of Zambia, across oceans, into corporate accounts in financial centers. Between 2000 and 2020, Zambia's copper output increased substantially. But government revenue from copper actually decreased. The country produced more and earned less. How is that possible? Transfer pricing. The corporations buying Zambian copper also controlled the companies selling it. They could set artificial prices between their own subsidiaries, buying cheap from Zambia, selling expensive elsewhere, ensuring profits appeared in low-tax jurisdictions rather than in Zambia itself. Grace Mulenga's school budget was cut because her government couldn't collect taxes from its own natural resources. Second direct question: if a country sells its most valuable assets and ends up poorer, who really owns those assets and who really made that decision? Here's the second micro-hook. The story I'm about to tell you is the one that should make you pause this video and sit with the numbers. Argentina, 2001. For a decade, Argentina had been the IMF's star pupil. They followed every instruction: privatized industries, opened markets, maintained a currency peg that fixed the peso to the dollar at 1-to-1. International investors applauded. The IMF praised Argentina as a model for developing nations. Maria Elena Gutierrez, the mathematics teacher from Part 1, believed in that model. She saved 43,000 pesos in her bank account, confident they were worth $43,000. That confidence wasn't naive. It was official government policy backed by the IMF. In December 2001, the system collapsed. The government froze all bank accounts. Maria Elena could withdraw 250 pesos per week, not enough to cover basic expenses. Then the peso was devalued. Her $43,000 became roughly $14,000 overnight. Then inflation eroded even that. Pause this video for a moment. Think about what that means. A woman who did everything right, worked for decades, saved diligently, trusted her government, and the international institutions advising it, lost 2/3 of her life savings in weeks, not through bad decisions, through following the rules. Now here's the rage moment. Here's what should make you want to share this video. In the months before Argentina's collapse, something remarkable happened. Large international banks and investors, the same institutions that had praised Argentina's policies, quietly pulled their money out of the country. They saw the collapse coming. They had access to information ordinary citizens didn't. They exited. Maria Elena Gutierrez had no such warning. She learned about the bank freeze on television like everyone else. $140 billion in capital fled Argentina in the years leading up to the crisis. The smart money escaped. The regular people were trapped. One liner that should burn. The insiders got lifeboats. The citizens got locked in the hull. After the collapse, the IMF's own internal evaluation admitted mistakes were made. Policies were too rigid. The currency peg was maintained too long. Fiscal targets were unrealistic. But those admissions came after. The damage was done. Argentina's poverty rate nearly tripled. Unemployment exceeded 20%. The middle class. Maria Elena's class was devastated. And here's the unexpected twist that connects everything. The architects of Argentina's disaster didn't face consequences. They got promoted. They moved to new countries, advised new governments, implemented the same playbook. The pattern isn't failure. The pattern is the system. Let me show you the mechanism clearly now. Visualize a flowchart. Country faces crisis. IMF offers loan. Loan comes with conditions. Conditions require cutting public services, privatizing assets, opening markets. Foreign corporations acquire assets cheaply. Profits flow abroad. Tax revenue drops. Public services decline further. Country needs another loan. Cycle repeats. At every stage, wealth moves in one direction, from poor countries to rich ones, from citizens to corporations, from the global south to the global north. James Mwangi, the former World Bank consultant from Part 1, with the folders full of loan agreements, has a name for this. He calls it the extraction machine. It's not that the machine is broken, he told me. The machine works perfectly. People just misunderstand what it's designed to produce. One more one-liner. The IMF doesn't rescue economies. It restructures them for someone else's benefit. The third unexpected twist is the most uncomfortable one. This isn't a secret conspiracy. It's all documented. The loan conditions are public. The outcomes are measured. The pattern is obvious to anyone who looks. 60 years of evidence showing structural adjustment increases poverty dependency and wealth extraction. The system continues, not because the evidence is hidden, but because the people making decisions benefit from the outcomes. The voting structure ensures wealthy nations control the institution. The creditors write the rules. The debtors have no choice but to accept. Amara Diallo lost her textile job in Senegal. Dmitry Volkov sold cigarettes in St. Petersburg. Grace Mulenga watched her school deteriorate in Zambia. Maria Elena Gutierrez lost her savings in Buenos Aires. Different continents, different decades, same pattern, same beneficiaries, and the machine keeps running. Because every year, $88.6 billion leaves Africa alone, nearly 4% of the continent's entire GDP extracted before it can build anything. Every year, more countries enter debt distress. Every year, more sovereignty is traded for survival. The question isn't whether this system exists. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is, what happens when the extraction reaches its limit? When there's nothing left to privatize. When debts can never be repaid. When entire nations realize the game was rigged from the start. That breaking point isn't theoretical. In some places, it's already arrived. And what comes next isn't rescue, it's consequence. Nations don't die in a single moment. They hollow out slowly, one cut at a time, until the structure that remains is just a shell of what it used to be. This is the story of what 60 years of structural adjustment has actually produced. Not in theory, not in IMF projections, in the lives of real people measured across decades. Let me show you two trajectories. Same continent, same starting point, different choices. In 1980, South Korea and Ghana had nearly identical GDP per capita, roughly $400 per person. Both were former colonies. Both had agricultural economies. Both faced the same global conditions. Ghana followed the IMF playbook. Structural adjustment programs in 1983, 1986, 1988, 1995, 2003, 2009, 2015. Each time the same conditions cut, spending, privatize assets, open markets, trust the process. South Korea rejected the playbook. They protected strategic industries. They controlled capital flows. They invested heavily in education and infrastructure, exactly what the IMF told developing nations not to do. When the IMF demanded South Korea open its markets in the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the Korean public was so outraged that citizens donated gold jewelry to pay off the IMF debt early and escape the conditions. Visualize two lines on a graph stretching from 1980 to 2024. Ghana's line rises slowly with frequent dips, a heartbeat monitor showing chronic illness. South Korea's line climbs steadily upward, accelerating with each decade. Today, South Korea's GDP per capita is approximately $35,000. Ghana's is approximately $2,400. The country that followed IMF advice is 15 times poorer than the country that rejected it. One liner worth remembering. The best predictor of a nation's poverty is how many IMF programs it endured. What most people get wrong about these outcomes is attributing them to culture, geography, or luck. The explanation is simpler and more uncomfortable. The policies themselves produce the poverty. Structural adjustment doesn't fail despite the conditions. It fails because of them. Let me show you how this plays out in individual lives. Emmanuel Osei was 22 years old in 1985, a newly qualified nurse in Accra, Ghana. His starting salary was the equivalent of $180 per month, modest but sufficient. He could afford rent, food, and to send money to his mother in the village. He believed in his country's future. Independence had come, progress was possible. His children would have better lives. Emmanuel is 62 now, still working as a nurse, earning the equivalent of $320 per month. In 39 years, his real income increased by roughly $140 per month. Not per year, total. His children did not have better lives. His son drives a taxi. His daughter sells vegetables in the market. Both have university degrees. Neither can find work in their fields because the economy never developed the industries to employ them. The hospital where Emmanuel works has the same number of beds it had in 1990. The population it serves has tripled. Now meet someone who made a different journey in the same years. Heinrich Müller was a mid-level manager at a German pharmaceutical company in 1985. His company saw opportunity in Ghana's privatized healthcare sector. As public hospitals deteriorated under austerity budgets, private clinics emerged, and they needed supplies. Heinrich's company expanded its African distribution network. He was promoted to regional director in 1992, then to vice president in 2003. Heinrich retired in 2018 with a pension worth $4.2 million. His success was directly connected to the conditions that constrained Emmanuel's life. Every budget cut that degraded Ghana's public health system created demand for private alternatives that funneled money to companies like Heinrich's. Same decades, same continent, same healthcare sector, opposite trajectories. Here's the first direct question. When the wealth created by one person's labor flows to another person's retirement account, is that economics or is that extraction? The mechanism compounds over time. That's what makes it so devastating. Grace Malenga, the Zambian teacher from parts 1 and 2, is 58 years old in 2024. Let me trace her trajectory forward. In 2034, Grace will be 68. She will still be working because there is no pension system robust enough to support her. Her school, the same building where she started teaching in 1993, will have 45 students per classroom instead of 35. 3 of her former colleagues will have emigrated to South Africa, Britain, and Canada, joining the brain drain that strips developing nations of their most educated citizens. The copper mines near her hometown will still operate. They will be owned by a consortium based in Switzerland. Annual profits will exceed $2 billion. Zambia's tax revenue from those profits will be approximately $80 million, less than 4%, because the privatization contracts locked in terms for decades. This is the first micro hook. The deals signed in the 1990s are still extracting wealth in the 2030s. Privatization isn't a one-time event. It's a permanent restructuring of who owns what. Now let me show you where that extracted wealth accumulates. Pierre Dumont manages a private equity fund in Geneva. He's 54 years old, specializes in emerging market infrastructure, and his fund holds stakes in utilities ports and mining operations across 12 African countries. His personal compensation in 2023 was $8.7 million. Pierre will retire in 2034 with assets exceeding $40 million. His children attend international schools. His grandchildren will inherit wealth. 4 generations of his family will benefit from investments made possible by structural adjustment conditions that required developing nations to sell their assets to foreign buyers. Pierre has never visited Grace Malenga's school. He wouldn't recognize her name. But his wealth and her poverty are connected by the same system, the same policies, the same decades-long transfer of resources from one part of the world to another. The contrast should disturb you. A teacher who dedicated 40 years to educating her nation's children will retire with nothing. A fund manager who extracted value from those same nations will retire with dynastic wealth. Here's the unexpected twist: Pierre doesn't think of himself as an exploiter. In his framework, he's providing capital to countries that need it. He's creating efficiency. He's following the rules of a system that rewards his behavior and punishes Grace's. The system isn't sustained by villains. It's sustained by people who believe they're doing nothing wrong. Let me give you the aggregate numbers. Visualize a balance sheet for the African continent. In 2023, Africa received approximately $50 billion in foreign aid. Headlines celebrated this generosity. The same year, Africa lost $88.6 billion through illicit financial flows, transfer pricing, tax avoidance, repatriated profits, and capital flight. For every dollar that entered, nearly $2 left. But even that calculation understates the extraction. It doesn't include debt service payments. It doesn't include the value of resources sold below market price to foreign corporations. It doesn't include brain drain, the economic value of educated citizens who emigrate because their own economies can't employ them. A comprehensive accounting shows that Africa is a net creditor to the world. The continent doesn't receive charity. It provides it to the world's wealthiest nations and corporations. Second direct question. If the flow of resources runs from poor to rich, who is developing whom? This brings us to the second micro hook. Some nations are beginning to recognize the pattern, and they're starting to refuse. In 2023, Burkina Faso expelled French troops and mining companies. In 2024, Niger terminated uranium extraction agreements with France that had been in place for 50 years. Mali, Chad, and Senegal began renegotiating contracts with former colonial powers. Western media called this a crisis. The nations themselves called it something else: sovereignty. Here's the second unexpected twist. The instability in the Sahel region isn't chaos. It's the beginning of rejection. Countries finally refusing terms that enriched others at their expense. Remember Kwame Asante from Part 2, the young man who danced in the streets when Ghana declared independence in 1957. He died in 2019 at age 84. His granddaughter, Abena Asante, is 28 now, the same age he was when freedom came. Abena has a degree in economics from the University of Ghana. She understands structural adjustment better than her grandfather ever did. She sees the pattern clearly: 60 years of development programs that produced more poverty, more debt, more dependence. She belongs to a generation that no longer accepts the premise that wealthy nations are helping poor ones. My grandfather believed independence meant freedom, Abena told me. I know that political independence means nothing without economic independence, and economic independence requires rejecting the institutions that keep us dependent. She's not alone. Across the global south, a generation is emerging that views the IMF not as a rescuer, but as an obstacle. They've seen the evidence. They've lived the consequences. They're no longer willing to trade sovereignty for loans that make things worse. One more one-liner to carry forward. The machine only works if the victims believe they're being rescued. The trajectory extends into futures we can already calculate. By 2040, Africa's population will exceed 2 billion, the youngest, fastest-growing continent on Earth. If current extraction rates continue, those 2 billion people will generate wealth that flows predominantly to shareholders and pensioners in wealthy nations. If the pattern breaks, that wealth stays in Africa, funding development, education, infrastructure opportunity. The stakes are measured in trillions of dollars and billions of lives. Maria Elena Gutierrez, the Argentine teacher who lost her savings in 2001, never fully recovered. She taught until she was 72 because her pension was worthless. She died in 2022 in the same small apartment she'd rented since the collapse. Her daughter inherited nothing but memories and a warning: never trust the system, never trust the institutions, never believe the rules protect you. The lesson is spreading. Country by country, generation by generation, the narrative is changing. But narratives don't change policies. Power does. And the power structure of the IMF, where one nation holds veto authority and the global north controls 9 times the voting weight of the global south, remains untouched. The question isn't whether the system will change. Extraction has physical limits. Debt has mathematical limits. Populations losing hope have political limits. The question is, what happens when those limits arrive? And for millions of people, they're arriving now. So here we are, 2025. Right now, as I record this, Sri Lanka is negotiating its 17th IMF program. Pakistan is on its 23rd. Egypt is restructuring debt for the 5th time in a decade. Zambia, Argentina, Ghana, Tunisia, Kenya. The same names appear in headlines today that appeared 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. The pattern doesn't change. Only the faces rotate. Let me bring you back to where we started. Grace Milenga is 58 years old now. I spoke with her last month over a video call from her small apartment in Kitwe. The internet connection kept dropping, infrastructure hasn't improved. She's still teaching in the same school building where she started her career 41 years ago. The roof leaks when it rains. There are 53 students in her classroom designed for 30. The mines are still producing, she told me, her voice flat with exhaustion. More copper leaves Zambia every year than when I was a girl. But somehow we have less than we did then. Less for schools, less for hospitals, less for everything except debt payments. Grace wasn't making a political statement. She was describing reality as she experiences it every single day. Visualize a timeline stretching from 1983, when Zambia signed its first structural adjustment agreement, to today. 42 years, 11 different IMF programs. At every point on that line, IMF officials projected that growth would come, that sacrifices would pay off, that temporary pain would produce permanent prosperity. At every point on that line, they were wrong. Here's the first direct question. How many decades of failed predictions does it take before we stop calling it miscalculation and start calling it design? I want to be careful here. Let me re-anchor what this video is actually about. This is not a conspiracy theory. The IMF isn't a shadowy cabal meeting in secret rooms. Everything I've shown you is documented in public reports, academic studies, and the institution's own internal evaluations. The loan conditions are published. The outcomes are measured. The pattern is visible to anyone who bothers to look. The goal isn't to find villains. The goal is to understand how systems work and who they work for. James Mwangi, the former World Bank consultant from Part 1, retired last year. He's 63 now, living in Nairobi, writing a book nobody will publish. His shelves still hold those folders, those thousands of pages documenting what he calls the extraction machine. I spent 30 years inside the system, he told me. I wrote the reports. I attended the meetings. I saw the projections and then the results. Nobody was surprised when countries got poorer. That was just what happened. It became normal, expected. And I realized if failure is expected and the system continues unchanged, then failure isn't failure, it's the product. That realization cost him his career. He speaks now not with anger, but with something quieter, the exhaustion of a man who tried to change something from inside, and learned that inside, nothing changes. The unexpected twist in 2024 is that alternatives are finally emerging. China's Belt and Road Initiative. Whatever its flaws, offers developing nations infrastructure loans without IMF-style conditions. BRICS nations are building alternative financial institutions. The new development bank based in Shanghai has disbursed over $30 billion without requiring structural adjustment. These alternatives aren't perfect. They may create their own forms of dependency, but their existence breaks the monopoly. For the first time in 60 years, countries facing crisis have somewhere else to turn. Visualize a map showing which nations have signed Belt and Road agreements. The red covers most of Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, precisely the regions most damaged by IMF programs. These countries aren't choosing China because they love Beijing. They're choosing options because they finally have them. This is the second micro-hook. The IMF's power depended on being the only lender. That monopoly is breaking. Let me close the loop on one more story. Dmitry Volkov, the Russian engineer who sold cigarettes after shock therapy, died in 2018. He was 67. His daughter Natasha is 44 now, a software developer in Moscow. She earns well by Russian standards, has rebuilt what her family lost. But she remembers. My father never recovered, she told me. Not financially, he eventually found work again. But something broke inside him in 1992. The belief that the rules meant something. That if you worked hard and saved money, you would be okay. That belief never came back. She paused. I don't save money in rubles. I don't trust any government's promises about currency. I invest in things I can touch or move. That's what shock therapy taught my generation. Trust nothing. Plan for collapse. Assume the rules will change without warning. Natasha isn't bitter. She's adapted. But adaptation isn't the same as thriving. An entire generation learned to survive rather than build. Second direct question. What kind of future does a country create when its citizens stop believing institutions can be trusted? Maria Elena Gutierrez. The Argentine teacher from Parts 1 and 3 died in 2022 without recovering her savings. But her daughter Carolina is alive, 47 years old now, teaching mathematics like her mother did. The pattern repeats across generations. The lesson passes down. The system doesn't protect you. Carolina doesn't keep money in Argentine banks. Neither do most Argentines who remember 2001. That distrust multiplied across millions of people shapes entire economies. It limits investment, constrains growth, perpetuates the very underdevelopment that structural adjustment claimed to solve. One liner worth remembering. The IMF's greatest legacy isn't debt. It's the destruction of trust. Let me offer a simple framework, not advice, just questions to carry with you. First, when an institution promises help but consistently delivers harm, what do the outcomes tell you about the actual purpose? Second, who benefits when developing nations remain indebted, dependent, and drained of resources? Third, if the rules were designed by creditors for creditors, why would debtors expect those rules to serve them? These questions don't have easy answers, but asking them changes how you see the world. The signature line that captures everything we've covered: colonialism didn't end in the 20th century. It just changed uniforms from soldiers to economists, from flags to loan agreements. Here's the final unexpected twist, the one that should stay with you. The IMF isn't sustainable. Extraction has limits. When debt becomes unpayable across dozens of nations simultaneously, as it is now, the system faces a choice. Forgive the debt and lose the leverage, or maintain the fiction and watch countries exit the system entirely. Both outcomes end the machine as it currently operates. What comes next is genuinely uncertain. It could be a new Bretton Woods, a multipolar financial system, a fragmentation into regional blocks. Nobody knows. But the 60-year experiment in structural adjustment is reaching its mathematical and political limits. Grace Malenga will probably not see meaningful change in her lifetime. Neither will James Mwangi or Natasha Volkov or Carolina Gutierrez. The damage stretches across generations, but their children might see something different. Abena Asante, the young Ghanaian economist from Part 4, represents a generation that understands the pattern clearly and refuses to accept it. They have data their grandparents didn't have. They have alternatives their parents didn't have. They have anger that might finally translate into change. Visualize a map of the world one more time, not showing IMF programs, showing youth populations. Africa has the youngest population on Earth. Asia has the largest. These billions of people will decide whether the extraction machine continues or collapses. The future isn't written, but the past is clear. I started this video with a number: $1.4 trillion paid in interest by developing nations in a single year. Money that could have built schools, hospitals, and futures. Money that flowed instead to creditors who already had more than enough. That number will grow next year, and the year after, until something breaks. One more one-liner, the one to carry out of this video. The question isn't whether the system serves you. The question is whether you'll keep serving the system. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm not here to offer prophecy or revolution. I'm here to show you how the machinery operates, who built it, who benefits from it, and who pays the price. What you do with that knowledge is your choice, but now you know. And knowing changes everything. The next time you hear that an institution exists to help struggling nations, ask a simple question. After 60 years of help, why are they still struggling? The answer isn't hidden. It's written across continents, across decades, across the lives of people like Grace and Dimitri and Maria Elena, people who followed the rules and lost anyway. The game was never fair. The rules were never neutral. And the house always wins. Until the players stop playing.